So we're going to take a look at evolution today, and a couple of ideas here we're going to take a quick glance at are going to be the evidence for evolution, and we're going to take a look at Darwin's ideas on how modern organisms evolved through descent from a common ancestor. So for the evidence of evolution, we're going to take a look at endosymbiotic theory, embryology, the age of the earth and fossils, biogeography, and comparative anatomy. So let's take a look at biogeography first. And we can see here that biogeography is just patterns in the distribution of fossils and living species. And we're going to combine that information with geology and kind of take a look at where these organisms have come from. In doing that, we're going to take a look at the age of the earth. We'll look at relative dating, absolute dating, and when you're talking about absolute dating, you're also going to look at the half-life and how we use half-life to determine the absolute date of a particular fossil. Relative dating is going to be comparing the fossils to known quantities. Then we can take a look at embryology, which is just going to be the study of early development in organisms. And we'll take a look at the endosymbiotic theory, which we have already discussed in the past. We talked about mitochondria and chloroplast and how they seem to be like unicellular organisms, so possibly how these organisms became part of larger organisms, mitochondria first, and then chloroplast later on in evolution. And then lastly here, we'll take a look at comparative anatomy. So we're looking at homologous structures, which are structures that are going to have a similar origin but a different function. Vestigial structures, which are structures that we have that we no longer use. And then analogous structures, which are structures that have a similar function but have different origins. All right. So taking a look at Darwin's theory, some things that he looked at on his voyage and in his research were that species are going to vary globally. They can vary locally as well, and they can also vary over time or change over time. Looking at the ideas that Darwin used to influence his actual idea of evolution, we take a look here. We've got some information from geology, Hutton and Lyell, talking about how the earth was very old and processes that occur now and shape the earth have been going on for many millions of years. This particular part gave Darwin's theory time to actually take place. Then we look at the information from a scientist named Lamarck, and he was one of the first to come up with a mechanism for how the species could actually change. However, his thoughts were and have been disproven. The idea of use and disuse and inheritance of acquired characteristics. Then we take a look at Malthus, and he stated that war, famine, and disease are going to be processes that can control population. And this idea of population control kind of made Darwin think, well, what are the reasons why certain organisms actually survive and why do others not survive? So this is that idea of survival of the fittest. And then taking a look at artificial selection, this is something that humans have been doing for years. Basically, the traits that we are looking for have been provided by natural selection or natural causes. And then we select those organisms that have the traits that we want in order to make sure that we can make more of those organisms. So the next thing we'll take a look at is evolution by natural selection. So again, natural selection is going to occur when you have more organisms that can, more organisms produced than can survive. And then again, which of those organisms survive? The ones that have the traits that are best suited to that environment. And some things that we'll look at there will be the variation in adaptation, the struggle for existence, and then, like I said, survival of the fittest. And the last thing we're going to take a look at here is According to the principle of common descent, all species living and extinct are going to be united by descent from an ancient common ancestor and exhibit diversity due to natural selection and adaptation. So organisms, through genetics, gain different mutations that may ultimately lead to adaptations that make them more suited for their environment. Those that are more suited to the environment tend to produce more offspring, and their genes are passed along. All right, so the next thing we're going to take a look at is this evolutions of populations. Let me get this out of here. All right, so we're going to take a look at the evolution of populations, and we're going to look at 4 different factors here. We're going to look at genes and variations, molecular evolution, the process of speciation, and evolution as genetic change. So let's take a look at genes and variation first. And from here, you remember that we have single gene traits and polygenic traits, and then the number of phenotypes that you can get from that is going to depend on the number of genes you have. So if you have a single gene trait, you have a dominant and a recessive form. But if you have polygenic traits, now you're adding in that second, third, or fourth layer of possible combinations. The more genes you have, the more combinations you can possibly get. So what are sources of the variation? Well, you can get mutations, you can have recombination during sexual reproduction, and you can have lateral gene transfer. This would be something that occurs, remember we talked about transformation of bacteria. This would be an example of lateral gene transfer. We're looking at populations. Remember, we're going to define a population as a group of individuals of the same species that can mate and produce offspring. And these populations have a gene pool, and a gene pool is going to be all of the alleles for a particular trait in that population. Okay, so the dominant alleles, the recessive alleles. If you're talking about polygenic traits, again, you're going to have to multiply that by the number of genes you're looking at. All right, so the number of times an allele occurs in the gene pool as a percentage of the total is going to be the relative frequency of alleles. Okay, how often does one allele occur versus the other? Okay, and evolution can involve any change in the frequency of alleles in the population over time. So again, the genotypes are the alleles, the phenotypes are going to be the physical traits. So if you see any change in the allele frequency or the phenotypes that are actually evolving from that, that can be evidence of evolution. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at evolution as genetic change. All right, and here again we have natural selection on single gene or polygenic traits. All right, when we're looking at polygenic traits, we can have something called directional selection, stabilizing selection, or disruptive selection. And when we're looking at these, directional selection means that you're going to select in one direction or the other. So these are kind of opposites. Stabilizing selection is going to select for the middle of the road, and disruptive selection is going to select for both ends and select against the middle of the road there. We have genetic drift, which can occur. Genetic drift is going to occur when we have small populations. The bottleneck effect is going to happen. Let's say you have some type of natural disaster and certain organisms ultimately survive, and it has nothing to do with how fit they were. It was complete luck as to where they where they happened to be during that natural disaster. And then the founder effect is what's going to happen after that, because the founder effect is going to be a small group of individuals with whatever their genes are. Whatever alleles they have, they're going to form the beginnings of a new population. All right, so when we're talking about evolution as genetic change, we look at genetic equilibrium, okay? And if the population is not evolving, the allele frequencies are not going to change, and you're not going to see a change in the genotypic or phenotypic ratio. You're not going to see a change in the relative frequency of alleles. And so when we're looking at genetic equilibrium, we're going to look at the Hardy-Weinberg principle. And the Hardy-Weinberg principle basically says that the populations are going to remain at genetic equilibrium unless certain factors are occurring. Okay, so because natural populations have non-random mating, They don't all necessarily have small population sizes. Okay, genes can flow in and out of a population due to immigration and emigration. Mutations do occur and natural selection does occur. Then populations are not going to be in genetic equilibrium. Okay, in order for the populations to be in genetic equilibrium, you need to have random mating. You need to have large populations. You need to have no individuals moving in or out of a population. You can have no mutations, and there cannot be any selective advantage or disadvantage for a particular set of traits. Okay, so that's why, again, the populations are going to change, because these things are actually in effect. And there's an equation that we're going to look at. Okay, it's p squared plus 2pq plus q squared equals 1, and p plus q equals 1, where p equals the frequency of the dominant alleles and q equals the frequency of the recessive alleles. Okay, so in the process of speciation, what we're taking a look here at is going to be some isolating mechanisms. Okay, isolating mechanisms are going to be things that cause organisms to be reproductively isolated. And those are going to be behavioral, geographic, temporal, biochemical, and anatomical isolation. Okay, behavior, self-explanatory; geographic, self-explanatory; temporal means there's a time variation between when different species are able to mate. Biochemical is going to be DNA and protein differences, and anatomical isolation is where anatomy of different organisms does not match up for reproductive purposes. We also have speciation and extinction. So in speciation and extinction, we have different macroevolutionary patterns. We have adaptive radiation, where an organism kind of fills different niches that are available. Convergent evolution is where organisms evolve similar traits because they live in similar environments. And coevolution is where two organisms kind of evolve together, and that could be a beneficial relationship in both cases, or it could be kind of they're two organisms at war. Okay, so one organism evolves something to defend itself against the other, and vice versa. We also have, we talk about extinctions. We have background extinctions. These are just the normal types of things that are occurring at a very low level constantly. And then we have mass extinctions, which are things like the meteor impact that killed the dinosaurs. Okay, there have been 5 major mass extinctions throughout the history of the Earth. We can also look at the rate at which evolution occurs. It can be gradual, very slow change over a long period of time. It also can be something called punctuated equilibrium, where you have a long period where nothing's really going on, and then you have a short period of rapid change. Okay. Fossil evidence does support both of these different hypotheses, that at certain times in certain organisms, change can occur very slowly, and at other times it may occur very quickly. All right, and then the last thing we're going to take a look at is molecular evolution. And this is basically saying that new genes can evolve through duplication followed by modification of existing genes. So this is basically, if you get some type of mutation that is occurring, it could be a chromosomal mutation, could be a gene mutation, and that mutation takes control and is affected in the phenotype of the organism, then it may end up ultimately changing that organism or that group of organisms' path. And then we can also take a look at something called molecular clocks, and this is where we can use the rate of mutation in the DNA to determine how long certain organisms have been separated in the evolutionary plan. So again, this has been evolution and evolution of populations. We will use different activities in the class to kind of reiterate and reemphasize some of these particular topics. See you in class.